Okay, good morning, everybody. So we're going to go ahead and start today. And I wrote on the board here that what we're doing today is we're going to talk about chapter 17. It's really the last chapter in the text. So last chapter in the course. And so we're going to cover that. It deals with fiscal policy, which we'll sort of put that in the context of overall government policy here. And that is where does fiscal policy sort of fit in to the mix here in terms of government policy to stabilize the economy. So we're going to do that today. Then when we come back today, on Thursday, we'll talk about the fourth exam, which is going to be this week, and I'll make it available probably sometime after class on Thursday. And you'll have until the end of the day, until the end of the day on Sunday, the 16th, in order to do that. So you'll have that opportunity. But we'll go over that and talk about what you should plan to expect for that particular exam. And then next week we will go over, assuming everyone's taken the fourth exam, which that may be a bit of a stretch here, because my experience is that there's usually at least one or two people who don't take the exam on time for whatever particular reason. And of course, I do allow makeup periods, so that sort of it bites, that sort of thing. But it's a trade-off, like with everything else. There's a trade-off, or pros and cons, for whatever you decide to do. So if we don't have everyone having taken exam 3 or exam 4, then we'll go over exams 1 to 3. I know that, and this is something the Attend Anywhere format is a little bit new to all of us, I think. This is, I think, maybe our third semester of doing it. And I think we've sort of been, I think I mentioned this to the class before, I think we've sort of been treating this as like an online section primarily, even though people are able to attend and do attend every class section. But we usually just make the exams available, and if anybody has questions about a particular question, they just get with us. But it seems like there's some interest in, at least in my other Attend Anywhere section, for going over the exams, answering questions as they arise, and in fact, they do tend to arise. And so I think that's a good thing, rather than put the burden on you. I'll put the burden on me, and I'll talk about that. It's not really a burden at all. It's for years before we did any online, I simply went over exams, so it's not a problem. So we'll do that on Tuesday, and then the final activity for the class is the final exam itself. And so we'll talk about what to expect on that, what some of the highlights of the course are. So we'll go over that, and really in either of these class sessions, if you've got something that really is an unclear area, it's a little bit vague, maybe needs a little bit of explanation, just bring those to class. If you're live in class, you can simply ask me here in class. If you're on the Zoom session, go ahead and you can speak out. You're free to do that. I know some people feel like they can't, but you should feel free to do that, or to just put something in the chat box and I'll see it. I may not see it the instant you put it in because I'm sort of around the room, but I will see it. So, okay. All right. So we're going to go ahead. So questions for me about anything, first of all, before we get started here, is there anything we're talking about this week? Okay, well, I told the class before we began, I broke a tooth over the weekend, and so I've got a little bit of a knife blade of a tooth that's sort of chopping into my tongue here. So I may sound like I'm a little bit impaired here, but just going to bear with me. It's one is to the dentist. I'm going to sort of suffer through, so it's my problem. But just to let you know, if I sort of run out of gas a little bit the way through, that's what's going on. Okay. All right, so let's talk about fiscal policy. Before we do that, let me just sort of zoom back out here a second and talk about fiscal policy in the context of government policy generally. And remember, we've talked about business cycles up to this point. And we said business cycles are these ups and downs of economic activity over time. And then we said government is involved in stabilizing the economy through what we call basically stabilization policy, which isn't one thing, it's really two things. And the first of these that we talked about was last week, and the first was monetary policy, which deals with the Federal Reserve and its actions at controlling the supply of money and the availability of credit. That's essentially what their role is. And so in the Federal Reserve, as we mentioned on last week, was composed of unelected officials, Federal Reserve Board members, along with 5 rotating members from each of the districts, from one of the 5 districts, or I guess 5 of the 12 districts, I should say. And they basically arrive at monetary policy. It's called the Federal Open Market Committee. And so whenever you hear on the news, hey, the Federal Reserve did this today or did that, what they're really talking about is the FOMC that did that. And And that is the Federal Reserve Board. All the members of the Federal Reserve Board are on that, plus those rotating members. And so that's essentially what's going on with the Federal Reserve, but they're unelected. And that's one of the key things, because as we indicated before, it's probably too much to ask for elected officials to do the kind of things which need to be done periodically, like what they're doing right now, raising interest rates, trying to shrink the money supply. It would be a lot to ask elected officials to get them to pull money out of the economy, but that's what the Federal Reserve is trying to do in order to get rid of this inflationary condition we've got going. So that's the first one. The second one is fiscal policy. I know we've covered this before, so I know it's not new, but it bears repeating. And so when we talk about fiscal policy, we're talking about government management of the budget function, taxation, government spending, and we're talking here about elected officials. Okay, so anyway, so let's talk a bit about this. And by the way, these slides I'll post a little bit later today. I've got these up and available for you, so you should be able to view those. So we're talking about taxation and government spending. Now, the G in this formula here is the G that we've already been talking about before. That is government spending. So you might remember from the expenditures approach to computing total output of the economy, we said the GDP was equal. C, which is consumption, spending by households. I, investment spending by businesses. G, right, government, obviously, and it's government at all levels. But we're primarily going to be talking here about federal government spending and then net exports, which we talked a bit about last week. So the G here is really, we're going to talk mostly about federal spending. And the reason why is this. Yes, I know that in the national income accounts, the government spending includes not just federal, but also state spending. In fact, state spending eclipses total amount of federal spending, which I think is probably surprising to a lot of people, particularly given the fact that, especially this time of year, we're very sensitive to the amounts we pay in tax, income tax that is, and most of us pay a lot more to the federal government than we do to state governments, or at least we think we do. But states raise their money through all kinds of different ways, like gas taxes, cigarette taxes, property taxes, sales taxes, a lot of the goods you buy. And so as a result, they sort of pick you off as you go throughout the year. The federal government does as well with withholding on things like payroll, but it's a little bit less visible. So, and actually, they're both intended to be somewhat invisible so that the government can raise money. So the G here is primarily government spending by the feds in order to sort of stabilize the economy. And again, we talked about the fact that it is the responsibility of Congress, the president, all of whom are elected. And that's a key thing to know, is the fact that it's a political process. And we're going to talk a bit about this idea of the politics of fiscal policy, because I think it's, as I mentioned the very first day of class, it's almost impossible to take a macro course without running into some sort of intersection with politics. Econ used to be called political economy for a reason. That's the idea that a lot of economic policy is in fact tied in with the political process. And so because you've got people who are sort of jockeying for position and power and whatnot, sometimes fiscal policy sort of looms in the balance here. And it's really dependent upon what these actions are and negotiating strengths and all these sorts of things that determine what our fiscal policy is. And right now, the big battle in fiscal policy is over the debt limit increase, which is a completely ridiculous conversation to have in the first place, but nonetheless, it's politics. The debt limit, and we'll talk about the debt, which is the national debt, and why it's gone up. And as a result, for whatever reason, Congress has passed a law that says they have to approve any increase to the national debt. The limit as to what the borrowing power of the government is. We've already hit that limit. The Treasury is using sort of reserves that they've got in order to keep the government funding and spending. And the Congress is going to do it. I can't imagine Congress not eventually raising the debt limit, but they're trying to play chicken right now with President Biden and trying to get him to agree to spending cuts, mostly because it's a political issue, the economy down. And it's his political adversaries, so that the economy looks worse coming into the 2024 election. I mean, that's just that. There's no other explanation for it, because the same party that wants to do that had no trouble doing it when they controlled the White House. And so it is about politics, and there is no other explanation for it. In the meantime, the financial markets are sort of teetering and tottering a little bit on that subject. I think by now we've seen this game play out several times, and so it's not that unusual. We know Congress is going to do it. It's just how much damage they're going to do in the meantime. And so to me, it's really irresponsible. It's really sort of immature, if you want my opinion. It's just my opinion. But we go through this all the time. Every 3 or 4 years, we just go through this debt limit increase, and we shut down national parks for a few days, and we shut down, I don't know, name the agency, the EPA or the FDA or whatever. And and we have this game of chicken, and ultimately Congress ends up caving in every single time because they have to, because government workers need to get paid. And I remember the last time they did it was that the government workers weren't going to get paid, and talk about hundreds of thousands of people who are going to be pretty angry. And so as a result, they did do it. So, but we'll talk about that in a second. We'll talk about the national debt, and I apologize for my rant there, but it is something that is very concerning, and it really shouldn't happen, that we end up playing this game all the time with really our economy, and it's over nothing, really. I mean, it really is. It's something we know how it's going to end in the end, at the end game. So we talk about the budget balance. We are talking about the idea if taxes equal government spending on an annualized basis, then we say the budget is balanced. And by the way, this equal sign is, I guess we should probably put a little squiggly and say more or less equal. I mean, we're not going to get to the penny and whatnot, but if T equals that, it more or less equals G, we say the budget is balanced. Now, there were efforts about 35, 40 years ago to get the budget in balance, because deficit, that is when taxation is insufficient to government spending, the budget deficits were beginning to be quite large, and so there were laws passed at the federal government level to try to rein in government spending that were later abandoned. So you get the idea that this idea of government trying to sort of bring its budget into balance is really a futile thing. And by the way, I know we've been hearing, at least I have, because I've been at this for quite a while, we've been hearing about the sky is going to fall with budget deficits for decades now. That, eventually it's all going to cave in on us, but it really hasn't happened yet. And I think the one reason why is because the economy continues to grow. And so as a result, it becomes less problem. I'll talk about that. I'll circle back to that in a minute. So when taxes are insufficient to cover government spending, we have a deficit. That's where we are at the moment. And the deficit has actually come down from present year, from the last year. Last couple of years prior to this one, though, have been a little bit unusual because of COVID, and the government was spending tremendous amounts of money in order to pump stimulus into the economy. And you could argue, and you can make a strong argument, the government probably did too much. And as a result, we've got an overheated economy, and the evidence for that is rising prices and a very low unemployment rate. In fact, the unemployment rate, we just got a report last Friday, the unemployment rate actually fell once again. So we were at 3.6% unemployment nationally. That's that U3 measure that I talked about. Now we fell to 3.5. Now, ordinarily, that's a good thing, but we're trying to slow the economy down to rein inflation out of the system. If we can do both, get low unemployment and low inflation, great. It's a little bit of a difficult balancing act, and right now it's primarily up to the Federal Reserve. And as we'll see, when it comes to stabilization policy, I think we need to be clear that the federal government, through our elected officials, can only do so much, really. And it's mostly, they do a better job of stepping on the gas to improve a weak economy than they do at hitting the brakes to slow down a speeding economy. And so while the Federal Reserve is trying to slow things down, hitting the brakes, raising interest rates, shrinking the money supply, or attempting to, the federal government, through elected officials, are probably going in the other direction. So there's a push-pull that's going on, and we'll talk about that in a second. Okay, and then when taxes are greater than government spending, the budget is in surplus. Now, we had a situation for about 4 years in the late 90s in which the government did have a surplus. This was, I think, a surprise to a lot of people. I know it was to me, but everything was pretty much going right. In fact, I can remember in the late 90s, I think around 99, I want to say, Federal Reserve Chairman at the time, a guy named Alan Greenspan, appeared before Congress and said that in 50 years of looking at the economy on a daily basis, things have been as good as low unemployment, low interest rates, low inflation, very booming economy, stable financial markets, stable banking system, pretty good balance of trade, all these kind of things were kicking in. And so it was good. In fact, the government had a budget surplus to the point where for about 4 years. And the question was, and I know Greenspan himself at one point made the comment, and it may have been more rhetorical, well, I'm sure it was rhetorical more than anything else, that what happens if we end up paying off the national debt because we're bringing so much money into the government? And because as we saw last week, we talked about one of the tools of monetary policy, it's managing open market operations. That is government getting involved in the bond market, which is primarily the treasury market. And if there is no federal debt issued by the Treasury, then how do they control that particular lever? Now, obviously, what happened was it didn't come to pass. When President Bush came into office in 2001, a big tax cut was passed. The government went back into deficit. Then we had the 9/11 terrorist attacks and a massive increase in spending on defense and security. So the budget went back into deficit. We've been there since. And we've got some pretty big deficits, close to $1 trillion per year. And the question is that too much? And what's the breaking point? And right now, I don't know that we really have an answer to that question, but we're going to come back to this issue of the national debt here in a second. Okay, let's talk a bit about this is not really your book, but I think it's important for us to talk about, because whenever we talk about taxes and government spending and the budget, then we have different philosophies as to how it should be handled. And I know that politicians are very, it sounds like I'm really against politicians, but they oftentimes will say what they need to say to sort of convince people. And oftentimes it's sort of misleading, frankly. And so sometimes they'll say, hey, households balance their budget every year. Why can't the government do it? And of course, to the average person, hey, that makes sense. That sounds like, why doesn't the government balance its budget? Why are they out of whack? We're in balance. Well, first of all, it's not even true that households balance their budget, even based on the criteria that they use. If a household buys a house and borrows $300,000 on an income, even a good income of $100,000, then that means they're not in balance because they're spending more than what they've taken in that year. Now, I'm not even saying that that's a bad thing. I mean, buying a house is probably a good thing, and people do it for rational reasons. But you cannot make the statement that households balance their budget every year, and therefore the federal government should do the same. It just doesn't even make sense. Either by the calculations which they use, which for households, we wouldn't even say a household's out of budget, out of balance, because they're simply adding debt, but they're also adding an asset that is a house. And so it's not really the case that they're not doing anything reckless by buying a house, right? And by the way, also when the government does something like, and it also differs from if you take the other actor in the private sector, businesses, where they might say, well, businesses balance their budgets. Well, not really that is so much either. But the government, if a business buys a building, they usually expense it over however many years that's expected to be around, 30, 40 years, whatever the case might be. So as a result, they expense it over a period of time, okay? But if government does something like builds an aircraft carrier, the entire cost of that aircraft carrier in the year in which they make the expenditure, and I realize it probably takes greater than a year to build an aircraft carrier, but we're building two at the moment. But that goes into expense and boom, it's all gone. There's no expensing it over 30 years or however long an aircraft carrier is expected to survive. But we dump into that all the expenditure. So as a result, we don't expense it over time. So it looks like the budget is way more out of balance than what it actually is. Because we have got the value of an aircraft carrier for the next 50 years or longer, however long aircraft carriers are expected to survive. So I think that's something that we need to keep in mind. So when we talk about balanced budget, it sounds like it's a great thing, having a balanced budget. But the problem with a balanced budget is that it may be what we call pro-cyclical. It amplifies the business cycle up or down. And basically how this process works is basically very simple. And let me sort of swivel the camera here a little bit. So if you think about, let's see, so we're kind of bring the lights up a little bit. When we talk about amplifying the business cycle, what have we got going on here with regard to a pro-cyclical business cycle? So let's say that the economy is growing, okay? And let me use black here. That black marker wasn't very dark. Let's see, let me find a different one here. So, So let's say the economy is growing, so we've got a rising GDP, okay? So we have a rising GDP, and because there's a rising GDP, we have a rise in corporate profits, and we have a rise in personal income. Remember, personal income is that portion of GDP that arrives at households before tax, okay? And as a result, taxes go up. When taxes go up, that is, more money is coming into the government because more people are paying taxes, because they're earning more. That means that to balance that, government's got to also increase government spending in order to keep it in balance, because we can't also raise a surplus. Keep in mind that surpluses, some people think surpluses are actually cheating the public because it's the public's money, et cetera. So that was the rationale in 2001 for a big tax cut, was it's the people's money, give it back to them. Of course, you always hear these arguments depending on what point of view somebody's arguing for. So if government spending goes up, it means aggregate demand goes up or to the right. And so as a result, GDP, which was already rising, is now going to rise more. And so we'll give that a double arrow. So it's pro-cyclical in the sense that it amplifies the current direction of the business cycle. If you're trying to balance the budget, and if G must equal T, if taxes are rising because the economy is growing, that must mean you have to match that with an increase in government spending because you also can't raise the surplus. You've got to give it back to people. Sounds okay, well, maybe, all right, so what? The economy is growing doubly fast, big deal. That's a great thing, right? Well, maybe not. What about this condition? What about when corporate profits are falling and personal income is falling because the economy is in recession? And that means that people are earning less income, taxes must go down because of the fact that people are earning less. And to balance that budget, we've got to cut government spending at a time in which generally we would want to increase government spending. Cutting government spending actually brings aggregate demand down, and so it brings the economy down doubly hard as a result. And by the way, we have evidence for this particular phenomenon happening because during the Great Depression, we had a condition in which the government was really fixated on balancing the budget. And I know that economists today and for many years after the Depression have been able to do the sort of post-mortem of what happened, what went wrong with government control the economy, which made the Great Depression last way longer than what it should have. It probably, in most economists' view today, it probably should have lasted a few months and it would have been over and we would have had a recession and just an ordinary run-of-the-mill recession, which we have all the time. We're probably heading into one now at some point. But because the government did all these things, they did the exact opposite of what they should have done. They actually cut government spending in order to balance the budget because they're fixated on that. Now, I, for one, give the government a little bit of leeway here because we're talking about 1929, 1930, 1933. And so there wasn't that much known about macroeconomics at the time. And I think also the other thing too, at least in the United States have become this world's bearer of the reserve currency, which we talked about last time or a couple of weeks ago. The reserve currency is that currency within the preeminent currency in the world. Countries want to hold it, other central banks want to hold it. It facilitates international transactions of various kinds. Major commodities are traded in like oil and certain grains and gold and whatnot. So, and because of the fact the dollar was backed by gold at the time, the feeling was, hey, if we have a deficit spending, we're going to debase the value of the dollar, which means that it's going to bring down the value of gold. So we're going to simply ruin the international monetary system that's now counting on us, the United States, to be the standard bearer. Now that we've just gotten this role, we've assumed that role, taken over from Great Britain, right? And they really had after World War I. I know that we talked about the Bretton Woods Conference, which was after or toward the end of World War II. And that was really more formalizing what was already really the case after World War I. Britain was just beaten badly in World War I. I mean, I know they were on the winning side. If they would not have been on the winning side, had the United States entered, probably. I mean, I guess it's arguable. I'm not, really willing to argue who would have won World War I if. But I know economically they were really banged up, and so the United States was really assuming that role. But they made the wrong decisions, and that's why the Depression lasted as long as it did. And by the way, our former Fed chairman, Ben Bernanke, who was an economist at Princeton for many years, just won the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago for his work on the Great Depression. And so, and it's really sort of the accepted story now as to what went wrong during that depression. So balanced budgets, as good as they might sound, actually may not be such a great thing after all, because of the fact that they do tend to amplify and exacerbate whatever's going on in the economy, for good or ill. And keep in mind, even though that top line may look pretty good, it's also potentially inflationary, and so we don't want that either. Okay? So what about a cyclically balanced budget where taxes are not equal to government spending? And that is where policy is designed to be counter-cyclical. So here, policy would work like this. I don't know, I swiveled the camera. I guess I wasn't ready to do that. Apologies. I'll post these PowerPoints so that you've got those available. But oops. These cameras, all the buttons are every different room I'm in. The buttons are wrong, so I kind of am swiveling around. I have to find out what works for what. So what about a budget that's in balance, but maybe not every year? And so what about a cyclically balanced budget where, let's say GDP is rising, so you've got corporate profits on the rise, personal income on the rise, taxes on the rise. This is a T. taxes on the rise, okay? So what is the intervention here? And it's this guy right here. Whereas here, government spending is meant to go down. This is the intervention. This is where the government would say, okay, the economy is growing great, let's cut government spending. And by cutting government spending, we hit a bit of a break on the economy, and we end up bringing the economy down just a little bit, with a little arrow down. And on the other hand, if we have an economy that's in recession, so we have now falling corporate profits and falling personal income, the taxes are going down. Here we go the other direction. We raise government spending, raise aggregate demand to bring the economy back up, and that's counter-cyclical policy. Counter-cyclical policy basically works to sort of counter the business cycle, particularly when the business cycle is leading you either to too fast of growth, which could be inflationary, or too slow growth, which could be recessionary and cause lots of unemployment. So the main intervention here is government. So this is why we're talking about fiscal policy, because the main body here, the main agent is government itself. They can step in and make a change if they need to. Now, here's the theory behind the cyclically balanced budget, because you're wondering, okay, how does this look like a balanced budget to you? It doesn't look like a balanced budget to me. Taxes are going up, we cut government spending. Taxes are going down, we raise government spending. That doesn't look like a balance. Theoretically, the surplus or the deficits in one year can be made up by the surpluses in the next year. So you have the balanced budget, but just not every year. You have a surplus, your deficit maybe the next few years or whatever, and as a result, over time, the more or less balanced. Okay, so that's one sort of philosophy. We call it a philosophy here, and I guess theoretically it would work. The problem with that is that unfortunately the behavior of members of Congress is that that's really not the case in practice, because what tends to happen is if there's a budget surplus, members either want to get more government spending for their own districts and their states. So as a result, they want to increase government spending, not cut it. They don't want to cut government spending. And they all, or I should say, they want to cut taxes. Because whenever there's a budget surplus, members will say it's the people's money, right? And when there's a deficit and it's the other party that's in power, they'll say, well, the government can't balance the budget. We need to cut government spending. We live within our means. But when it's their party in power, and this is both parties, by the way, this is not a Democratic or Republican thing, this is either party. When their party is in power, it's like, that's people's money. You give it back to the people, increase government spending, and you can cut taxes. So it's difficult in practice to make this happen. So what's the default position? We tend to have deficits year after year after year after year. And now, is that a big issue? Well, I think it really depends upon your point of view. And I think there's been a lot of work that's been going on, that's been happening in macroeconomics for a lot of years, even fairly recent work that suggests that maybe budget deficits aren't quite as bad as what we think they are. And I'll tell you the reason why here in just a second. And I will give you a metaphor that does apply to the household, that does, I think, work as an explanation of the broader economy. Okay? All right, so questions about budget philosophies as it relates to the balanced budget. Oh, you want me to hold on there? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I will post these PowerPoints here, so you've got this. I haven't put them up yet because I was still sort of fiddling with these last night. And this chapter, we don't usually often get to this chapter at this point in the class, and so I had to kind of move some things around. And we've only been using this particular text for a little bit of time. Okay. The final topic here, by the way, is one that's much more pragmatic, and it's what's called functional finance. Functional finance basically says deficits, surpluses don't matter. and therefore, the goal of fiscal policy is simply to achieve non-inflationary full employment. Now, by the way, when we talk about macroeconomics, and I've said this before, I'll probably say it again, we have to ask ourselves the question, what are we doing? Why are we studying macroeconomics? What are we doing? Right? The whole purpose is to try to solve problems. And if we are not solving problems, then why study it? Why we study anything, right? Why we study pollution, why we study disease? We're trying to fix the problem. So this is one issue. This is why we study macro. And so if the goal of macro then is to achieve non-inflationary full employment, then let's just focus on that and let deficits and surpluses work their own way out. If it becomes a problem, we'll know it because we get something not akin to non-inflationary full employment, and we'll deal with that. And it sounds like maybe it's okay, we're going to punt the ball, we're not going to deal with it at all. But that may not be that unconventional of a view. And I know that Dick Cheney, who was vice president under President Bush, had said that he goes, well, we learned a lot during the 1980s that really deficits don't really matter. And some people thought, well, that's sort of his departure from the view of his party that deficits do matter. But it was sort of the view, I think, of a lot of people in politics that maybe these deficits aren't that big of a deal after all. And maybe they're not. And we'll talk about why that might be the case. Okay. All right. So any questions about philosophies of how to handle a budget as relates to trying to get it into balance or not? Okay, let's talk about taxation. All right. So this is also not in your textbook, and so I think it's something we should talk about here. And that is this idea of who's to pay tax. And the answer is usually somebody else, right? Because nobody likes to pay tax. So there are two very broadly different views of taxation, and it really depends upon your particular view of people's role in the economy, their level of responsibility for themselves. I think it's probably safe to say that's one of those viewpoints, particularly as relates to the first one, the benefit principle, and also what is more pragmatic. By pragmatic, I mean do what works. Okay. So the first principle is something called the benefit principle, which on its surface, I think maybe it looks like a shiny object, maybe even sound completely logical. It's the idea that those who get the most benefits from the government should pay the most in taxes. So as a result, if you get the most in benefit, you should somehow pay your way, and therefore repay in higher taxes in some proportion to the amount that you get. This is actually not that different than the very first language in the Constitution of the United States about taxation generally, and which is extremely vague. In fact, for a lot of years, there was doubt as to whether or not the federal government could even have an income tax, because of the fact that some people interpreted the Constitution as being very, very literal. The Constitution basically says this: it's since been amended, and since we've had a slew of statutory law and case decisions that have sort of modified this, but the original language was that the federal government can levy taxes in proportion to the states. That's all it says. In proportion. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean that every state pays the same amount of taxes? New York, a big state, pays the same amount as Rhode Island, a small state. Does it mean that every individual is taxed equally within those states? That's not really what it says. Does it mean that in proportion to states, that if one state gets more benefit from the government, then that state pays more in tax? It is exceptionally vague. And like so much in the U.S. Constitution, it was written, more than 200 years ago. And I don't think anybody thought that we'd have the kind of economy that we have today, which obviously we have figured out how to have an income tax at the federal level. But keep in mind that income tax has only been around since I think 1912, 1913, something like that. I mean, that sounds like it's a long time ago, but keep in mind that's about 150 years in when there was no income tax. The federal government was basically making its money on taxing of goods coming in, tariffs. Right? So this idea of the benefit principle is sort of old school in a lot of ways. It also is sort of this, I guess maybe a kind of frontier justice kind of a thing that, hey, you should pay your own way. If you have to have government support, then you simply have to make government whole on what you should pull yourself up by your own bootstraps kind of thing. I think that's sort of the logic of that. The problem with that is that very often the people who get the benefit need the benefit, and so therefore, if they didn't need the benefit, then they wouldn't get the benefit in the first place. But because they need the benefit, they also are unable to simply pay the tax. It's like trying to collect money from somebody who simply is unable to pay. And keep in mind too that the original purpose of federal spending was not really to do the kind of things that the federal government does today, like care for the sick and the disabled, and to care for survivors of lost parents and whatnot. There are a lot of things the government does that was never really envisioned. And so the benefit principle, even though it sounds like sort of maybe logical and even fair, is not very applicable. It's not very operational at all, especially in the economy today, where we expect government to do these kind of things like provide safety nets, both at the federal and state level, but primarily we're talking about the federal level here. Okay. So the second principle of taxation is simply the one that's most pragmatic, the one that's most applicable and useful and operational. That's the ability to pay principle. And that is, we tax those who earn the most money. We tax those who earn the most money. And so the ability to pay principle results then in what we simply call tax brackets. And the tax bracketing is simply this: the more you earn, the more you pay, not in dollars necessarily. Well, it will be dollars, but in percentages, and therefore, if the percentages go up, so do your tax amounts paid. Okay, and so when we talk about this, and I know that the subject of taxation, we have two entire classes here at CNN on taxation. So you'll forgive me if I don't give you every detail about taxation. Not that you want to hear it, I'm sure, but I just want to give you a bit of a very quick and dirty idea of how marginal taxation works. That is this idea of brackets. And so let's talk a bit about how taxes work. And let's just take an individual. And I'm going to give you some hypothetical figures here, and realizing, of course, that when it comes to individual tax, there are actually different filing statuses. There are actually 5 different filing statuses: single, married filing, joint, married, separate, all that. And so I realize that I'm trying to simplify the analysis, but it basically works like this. If you have taxable income, which itself is arrived at after making certain adjustments to income, taxable income here, and then you have what's known as the marginal tax, or taxable income here, and then the marginal tax rate. Okay, marginal tax rate is this percentage of tax that one pays. So this is a dollar figure, this is a percentage. Okay, so let's say your income is 0 to 25,000, you might pay 10% on that first 25,000. And then if it's 25,001 to say 35,000, you'll pay 15%, but it's 15% on the amount between 25,001 and 35,000. Again, these are hypothetical numbers. Brackets are different depending upon filing status and everything else. 50,000, it might be, sorry, I apologize for that. It's actually my dentist calling me back there. So hopefully telling me they have an opening for me. So 35,000 to 20 to 50,000, maybe say 25%, and then over 50,000 would be, let's say 30%. Those are not real numbers, those are hypotheticals. So what does it mean? And when we talk about this idea of a progressive tax rate, these rates go up because they are what are called progressive. So this is a progressive tax system, and you want to make sure you know that term. Progressive tax system, meaning the more you make, the more you pay in percentage tax. And so how that works is essentially, once you start to earn more, you start to pay more. Your first 25,000 maybe taxed at 10%, next 10,000, 15%, the next 15,000 at 25, etc., and then over 50,000 at 30%. And it's taxable income, which itself is sort of makes adjustments for things like IRA contributions and things like healthcare premiums and all that. So this is why we have 2 different classes that go into these details. But the idea is it's progressive, meaning that we tax those who have the ability to pay more than those who have lesser ability to pay. And I realize too that there are people in our society who don't pay any tax at all. Their effective tax rate is in fact not just 0, but it's actually negative, because we have a number of credits, both at the federal and state level, that actually pay people a tax refund where they may not owe tax at all. At the federal level, it's called the earned income credit. The earned income credit obviously requires you to have earned income. Then you might get money back over and above what you paid in. And particularly if you have dependents, either 1 or 2 dependents, that tends to help your situation. So there are a lot of people who don't pay taxes at all. And it's not because they're slipping through the knot, it's because they're not required to. It's part of progressive tax policy to pay people who have less income more in terms of getting money back. There's also part of the child tax credit is also what we call refundable. It can create a negative tax for you. And even not all states have such a thing. We do in New Mexico. We have 2 of those provisions. One is called the comprehensive tax rebate. I think it's called the low income comprehensive tax rebate. There's another called the working families credit, both of which are really intended to give money back to those in the lower income scale. So yes, I realize that not everyone pays taxes, but that's by design. So it's a progressive tax system. So really the principle that we operate under in terms of these 2 is not the benefit principle. It is the ability to pay principle. The ability to pay principle basically says those who are most able to pay will pay the most in taxes. Now, by the way, are there taxes out there that are the opposite, that are regressive? And the answer is yes, there are. There are taxes that are regressive. And I had a slide, I think it just kind of vanished as I was looking over this last night. It went away. And that's where one reason I didn't post it yet, because I got to try to find it here. But I had an example of a regressive tax, and primarily a regressive tax is one like sales tax, which is regressive. The reason it's regressive is because, and that is, if you earn less, you pay more. The reason why is because low-income households spend a greater percentage of their income, and they often spend it on goods which are subject to sales tax. Not all, certainly. There are goods that are not subject to sales tax, but that depends upon the jurisdiction. It's a state tax levied, and in Mexico, it's state and local both that sort of pile on with sales taxes that we call the gross receipts tax, but it's a sales tax. And so if you earn less, you probably pay a greater percentage of your income away in that tax. If you earn a very high income, you're going to save some and not spend it, so it's not subject to sales tax. So therefore, sales tax is really a regressive tax. And the example I was going to show you is showing how in some states, I know a lot of people say, hey, move to Florida, there's no state income tax. No, there's not. There's also very high sales tax. And the same goes with Texas. It doesn't have a state income tax, but has a very high real estate tax. I know when I was in banking and we did a little work in Texas, it was amazing how to us it was, at least how big the property tax was. I mean, government's got to collect money somehow. And so there's no income tax, they've got to give it. They've got to give it somehow. Okay. All right. So let's talk about this idea of stabilization to the extent that stabilization is a thing and it can work. And we already defined what the terms expansionary and contractionary are because we got into that policy last week. So expansionary is basically to try to deal with a underperforming economy. When the economy is underperforming, there's high unemployment, low growth. So as a result, we said in monetary policy, the tools are lower interest rates and increase the money supply by things like injecting money into the economy through open market operations. Well, what about in the case of expansionary policy? Those aren't the tools that are at the disposal of elected officials. So what they could do is they can lower taxes, they can increase government spending, or they can do both. And they very often do both in the case of a recession. So this is very much counter-cyclical policy, and it usually is very effective. And if you remember back into our discussion from chapter 12, where we talked about Keynesian theory, which was really the very original macro theory that existed, it was to deal with very high unemployment and very slow growth, really in the industrial economies. And so Keynes' solution was to do this, to primarily increase government spending. He was actually a bigger fan of that than cutting taxes because he thought, well, okay, you cut taxes, but people are already not earning very much. And there wasn't no effective means of collecting, especially personal tax. So he was in favor of increasing government spending. Today, lowering taxes also works. And by the way, during the last downturn in the economy, which was we had like a 1-month recession in March of 2020, the government was involved in doing those very things through what we call stimulus. And, I know by now everyone's heard the word stimulus and we're sick to death of hearing it, but the term has been around for a very long time, at least as far back as macro goes. It's really an effort to try to deal with slow economies. On the fiscal side, taxes and government spending are the tool. On the other hand, what about in a case in which growth is too high and the government needs to slow things down? They can raise taxes, lower government spending, or some combination of both. The problem here is that we're talking about elected officials. And politically, these are not particularly palatable. And I think, frankly, that elected officials really like the fact that there's a Federal Reserve composed of unelected officials who do this work for them, not with the same tools, because the Federal Reserve doesn't have taxes and government spending at its disposal. But they simply do it with probably a more effective mechanism, and that's the money supply. And I think the government likes to put this off on somebody else. And by the way, elected officials are always critical of the Federal Reserve. It's got to be a thankless job. And as long as I've been doing this, you hear very little praise of the Federal Reserve. You hear lots and lots of criticism. Nobody's happy all the time is the way it seems. Even though I think the Federal Reserve mostly gets it right. And if you want any evidence of that, don't take my word for it. Look at GDP and how GDP in the early part of the 20th century did this. And then the latter half it sort of did that, kind of wobble. The wobbles went down a little bit. The economy got a little bit more stable. It didn't mean that we weren't subject to shocks at times, like the 9/11 terrorist attacks, which increased government spending. through the economy to recession, or the pandemic, which nobody really saw coming, at least in the economics world. I don't think most of us saw it coming. There are shocks that happen that are non-economic in nature, but for the most part, I think the Federal Reserve has done a pretty good job. The thing we can say about contractionary fiscal policy is it tends not to be very effective. The reason it tends is this is really not the tool that politicians want to go with. It just is not politically popular. I mean, think about this. The last presidential candidate who ran for office saying he was going to raise taxes was a guy named Mondale who just got crushed at the polls by Ronald Reagan. And people didn't want to hear that. And why would they want to hear that? And I'm not saying that he would have won had he had a different message. He probably would have gotten beaten anyway. Ronald Reagan was a very popular president at the time. It went over like a Led Zeppelin. It just did not go over well at all. So it didn't really work. Sometimes you hear politicians run on increasing taxes on the wealthy. Joe Biden did that, was pretty successful at doing it. Bill Clinton did that a little bit and said we're going to raise taxes on the wealthy. Bill Clinton also said we're going to cut taxes on the middle class. And then when he got into office, he sort of went back on that idea a little bit. And he had a really rough start out of the gate as president because he kind of got caught in trying to go back on that particular promise. But you get the idea. Politicians sort of get themselves in knots. And then at the same time, the person he ran against for president, George H.W. Bush, had run the first time saying no new taxes, no new tax. And then he went back on his promise when he became president. So presidents, they oftentimes don't talk much about taxes because it's probably just as well to not talk about them. I think they've sort of learned that. And the only thing that's really popular is to say, let's tax the rich. And President Biden, for his part, has been saying anybody who earns over $400,000 a year. And that's a small percentage of the population. So, yeah, they vote. Any of them out there that are going to sway a particular election. So this idea of increasing taxes, it's just not particularly palatable. Elected officials being what they've got to deal with. Okay. So any questions about what's going on here? I'm going to jump a slide here and talk about how the government finances its deficits. I think I'm going to sort of move these around a little bit. There we go. Okay. So I want to talk about deficit financing. So what is deficit financing? We know if in the case of when the government spends more than what it takes in on an annual basis, they've got ways they've got to plug the gap. I mean, the checks have got to keep coming, right? So what do? Well, the first thing they do primarily, this is the main issue, is they borrow money. They borrow money from the public. Now, what does that mean, the public? Well, that's a pretty big topic. And we mean the global economy. That's what we mean by the public. So anybody in the world can buy federal debt. I don't think there's anybody who won't take their money from. I mean, all you just have to do is go buy treasury debt. And treasury debt is simply denominated in terms of maturity. Bills, notes, and bonds, they all differ in maturity from 90 days up to I think 30 years. They stopped issuing 30-year bonds a few years ago. I think they're back now. But there are different maturities of treasury debt. It's out there. It's been around there for a very long time. And by the way, that is one of the tools the Federal Reserve uses on this other side of the equation to manage the economy. So there's lots of debt out there. So when Alan Greenspan was sort of wondering out loud about what would happen if the government paid off all the debt because they were bringing in more money every year than what they were spending. So that, and as a result, the money was being used to pay off the debt. Well, it didn't really happen. So borrowing money from the public. The possible consequence of this is that it can drive up interest rates and crowd out seekers of private funds. Let's talk a bit about this because this is a topic that occasionally comes up. And we hear this occasionally, and it's been around for a long time. And it's this idea of crowding out. And if you've ever heard the term crowding out, this is what it basically means. So if you've got I'm going to erase some of this here. Let's say you've got, well, first of all, anybody who borrows is borrowing from someone else's savings, okay? Someone else's savings. So as a result, if you've got the national savings, which is this giant pool, okay? And it's probably more appropriate to talk about the world savings rate, but I think crowding out usually refers more to the domestic economy. So government is coming in and taking a bite out of this. It's sort of working its way in here. It's doing what? It's shrinking the available pool of private savings that's available for people to buy homes, to buy cars, businesses to borrow, to expand inventory or whatever. So as a result, they're crowding out private seekers of capital. Loanable funds are less available because the government's they're crowding them out. And it does a couple of things. Number one, it shrinks the available rate of savings. And so if savings available as loanable funds goes down, i.e. it becomes more scarce, what happens to the price of it? It goes up. That's just a law of economics. And if something becomes more scarce, the price of that thing goes up. And so as a result, the cost of borrowing goes up. And so the idea behind borrowing money is that it might crowd out private seekers of capital. Okay, this has been a theory that's been around for a long time. The problem with it is, and I bring it up only because we hear about it, there are some economists who still sort of buy it, but it does not appear to be a very strong theory. The reason why is because the government's been borrowing for a very long time, and it really hasn't affected interest rates as a result. Rates have gone up mostly because of inflation now, but rates were ultra low for many, many years. I mean, like scraping the bottom towards zero for a good 20 years. So and the government's borrowing money like crazy. I mean, since 9/11, the government's just borrowing. We haven't had surpluses since the late 90s. And since the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the government has been borrowing like crazy to finance all kinds of things, increasing defense spending. The COVID response was expensive, and all these kinds of activities. And so as a result, if it drove out private seekers of funds, then I think we would have seen it by now. And that's this. There's one giant fire hose that's coming in here, and that's this. It's foreign money. It's global financial capital. Okay, so it's global money that's coming in to finance that as well. And I know this is a part of it, and I don't want to over exaggerate this because I know that a lot of people say, oh, well, the Chinese own a lot of our debt and whatnot. Well, they do, but it's not that significant. And I know we've heard this before, and some of this is a little bit hysterical, I think, frankly, because a lot of people will say, oh, the Chinese could wreck our economy if they decide to sell our government debt and drive the price down on bonds and drives rates up and wreck our economy. But that would be sort of suicidal on their part. Why would they want to do that? If you're selling something, selling, whatever you're selling, the price goes down because it becomes less scarce. Why would the Chinese government want to do it? It doesn't really make any sense. To make some kind of point, it's really not important. And also, we should be clear too, and I bring this up only because we keep hearing about it. I hear about it a lot from people, but the amount of debt held by the Chinese is not that large, really. In fact, it's held by a lot of people all throughout the world. In fact, to be honest with you, one big owner of the national debt is the Federal Reserve itself. Federal Reserve, and so here you've got this game where the Treasury borrows money. It's the administration, the Treasury borrows money, the Federal Reserve lends the money through open market operations. So a lot of the debt is actually owned by the Federal Reserve itself. So it's not, so the government is borrowing from itself, in other words, to pay for current government spending. And right now, one of the very hot areas in economic research is this idea of what this all means, this coordination of fiscal and monetary policy. Remember, the Federal Reserve, is responsible for monetary policy. However, it's the president, and when I say the president, I'm also talking about the U.S. Treasury, which is part of the administration, of which the president is the head. They're on the fiscal policy side. So we've got two different coordinating bodies sort of working together. And it's what's called modern monetary theory as to what that all means. It can't work effectively. And that, therefore, do deficits really even matter in the first place? That's a big question. Okay, so that's something that is to be option here. That's simply creating more money, printing more money, what's called debt monetization. This sounds like maybe it's a bit of a fantasy land. This idea, okay, well, it'd be nice if we could do this, right? This is another reason why these metaphors that link government action to the household simply don't work. Because if you spent more money 1 month than what you took in, you can't just go print more money. It'd be really nice. There's a reason why you don't. And so the government could do the same thing. And that sounds like it's crazy. But in fact, the government can and does do that very thing. They create money. And the Federal Reserve is primarily the agent that would do it, particularly if they keep buying government debt, and which they do. And so every time the government issues debt that the Federal Reserve buys, it's really an act of money creation. So money creation, we said, was done two ways. Commercial banks do it when they lend money to borrowers, creates new money. We talked about that. But also the government can do it through the actions of the Reserve. And they do it every time they buy, they engage in open market. So they can do what we call monetizing the debt. Also, one other thing about this is the Federal Reserve also has the power to simply say, okay, some of this debt that we've got on our books, we'll just simply forgive it, federal government. And they could do that, and they could make that debt go away like it never happened. And because what's the harm? There's no harm, no foul. The only interest being paid is to the Federal Reserve itself. And the Federal Reserve is already turning over excess interest to the Treasury all the time. And, because the Federal Reserve doesn't need it. What do they need it for? They're not running a business. It's a government agency. And so as a result, the debt, the interest they're earning, they simply turn back to the Treasury. So this cooperation between federal fiscal spending and monetary policy it can be very productive. Okay, it can also be inflationary if, in fact, the government is spending, and again, it requires the cooperation of the Federal Reserve. But in the case of the 1960s, I know that I posted that video. I posted a video link. I can't recall if we saw it in class, the Milton Friedman video, but I think we did. But Friedman talked about his big concern was during the 1960s and 70s, the government was spending like crazy, and the supply side simply couldn't catch up. And so as a result, it was really highly inflationary, particularly since the Federal Reserve was buying a lot of debt, and because of that, it was an inflationary environment. So the government itself can overspend, and as a result, it can be an inflationary condition. Okay, tax increases are one possible way to finance the deficit. The here might be the economy might slow down, so therefore you're asking government to do contradictory things, lower taxes, because raising taxes slows the economy down. So the paradoxical view is you raise taxes, you get less tax revenue in. That's a problem. Why do you get less tax revenue when you raise taxes? Because you slow the economy down. So you get lower revenues, and at the same time you have to increase transfer payments to things like employment benefits, medical assistance, all these kinds of things. And it may actually raise the deficit by increasing taxes. As ironic as all that sounds, it does look ironic, and it is. Okay, and it is. To talk about surplus financing, let's talk a bit about that. And what surplus financing? This is a little bit of a different animal, but it's one that we actually experienced. And believe me, I was teaching before we ended up having our first surpluses of my lifetime, that is. And so it was interesting to know what the government's options were. And one of the options was to pay off the debt. And that's what they were doing. In fact, there was a lot of talk back in the late 90s that, hey, let's just pay off the debt. If we have deficits year we're getting, let's just pay off the debt. Because, politicians, you've been telling us for years the debt is a bad thing. Deficit spending is the devil's work. It's irresponsible. It's all this, it's that. And, all right, let's just pay the debt off. The problem is it can actually drive interest rates down sharply because of the fact that increase in private savings that will result. If savings become less scarce, then the price of savings through the loanable funds market actually goes down. And so as a result, maybe it goes down too low. And we've seen the effects of this because for the last 20 years, when rates were extremely low, savers, that is bank savers primarily, but even like bond savers just weren't being compensated very much for their money. And what that meant was people to get a yield on greater risks and probably they were comfortable with, like the stock market. I mean, today, sit on a federally insured bank deposit, and people should be flocking to that because if you just go back two years ago, people were killing each other to get a 5% yield on stock that could go to zero. Today, your money won't go under any circumstances because the government has demonstrated they will not let depositors suffer the loss, even if they're over the limits of FDIC coverage. They've stepped in. I don't know if they'll keep that up if there are more bank failures, but up to 250,000, you are safe. And it's not just 250, it's 250, and then if you have a spouse, it's 250 for that person. It's 250 jointly, so there's 750 given up, and that's another 250. So I mean, the limits are not, they're bigger than what it even seems. And but if those rates go down simply because you've got very low rates, we see disadvantages to that. Now today we're obviously moving the opposite direction, but we've got big deficits right now. Okay, the other possibility is impounding the surplus, and this has not really been done to my knowledge, where we simply take the surplus, put it on the bench, put it in reserve somewhere, and then pull it back out when we need it. I know that there are some accounting systems around the world that will do that in the private sector. I think in Japan, they've got a different system than what we use in accounting. If they have a profit in 1 year, they want to segregate some of that profit and pull it out and dump it into a year in which they want to smooth out income. We don't really do that here. This idea of putting it aside, pulling it back out, it's not really done. Or tax cuts, which is something we've done. That was what was done in 2001. Actually, it was tax cuts, which meant that the economy slipped back into deficit. The economy slipped back into deficit as a result of that. Okay. All right. About 9 minutes. So I may not get all the way through this today. In fact, I probably will not. I'll probably have to pick some of this up on Thursday. Let's talk about the difference between deficits and debt. This is something that I think is confusing to some, and some people get confused. And they are related, but they're separate. And that is the deficit's the annual shortfall. It's every year the amount by which taxation does not cover government spending, that is taxes or less than government spending, we call that the deficit. Okay. But the national debt is the accumulation of all outstanding deficits over time that we're still financing, i.e., that have not been paid off yet. And the national debt goes up and up and up and up. And the question is that a problem? Is that a problem for the debt to go up and up and up? And I think that one way of looking at it is, well, the debt goes up, which means the interest on the debt also goes up. And so every year that goes by, tax money has to go to pay interest on the debt. That's not a great thing. That's probably a bigger issue than the amount of debt overall that's outstanding, is the amount of what we call debt service. That is the annual payments and interest or periodic payments of interest on bondholders to finance our debt. So that's out there. And by the way, the national debt, because it goes up and up, we've never paid it off. The United States is still paying for World War I, paying for World War II, still paying for the Vietnam War, we're still spending for the space program. All these kind of things are still out there. And with no, until we pay those debts off, they'll be out there. And this is not unusual. I know that sometimes we get this idea that we're somehow unique in the sense that we're the only country that can't balance its budget. That is far from the case at all. In fact, we're far from the only country that has a low debt to GDP ratio as what we do. A lot of countries have much higher amounts of debt in relation to total GDP. And in fact, a lot of countries have no desire to pay off a lot of their debt in the first place. I think I mentioned that the bond issue that's out there that has no maturity. And it's been around for 200 years. It was set to consolidate the debt that the British government incurred to fight Napoleon 200 years ago. They consolidate all that debt in one giant bond issue, and there's no maturity because they didn't know when they would ever be able to pay it off. To them, the fight against Napoleon was an existential event. It was almost like either we crush Napoleon or we cease to exist. It was that serious of a thing. So therefore, to pay it off, would have simply said there's no maturity. They just pay interest every year, and that's it. And they have no plans to pay it off ever. Maybe they will at some point, but it's unlikely. They haven't done it yet. They probably won't. So that's one issue there. And one final thing, because I was going to get into some of the timing issues. And then I also wanted to contrast fiscal and monetary policy. I wanted to show you something that I think is interesting, and it's something that I know it's sort of a gadget. I know it's one of those shiny objects, but it is something called the national debt clock. And if I could pull it over here, and it's something that there's some entity that maintains. I just think it's kind of a fun thing to look at, and so it looks like this, so that you can pull it up for yourself if you like. And it has the national debt, and of course it's running upward and all that. But it's also got a lot of other data on here, and I can shrink it down on the screen. Maybe it'll be easier to see, but it's got a lot of other data like payroll tax revenue and corporate profits and all these kinds of things. Obviously, the big hits the national debt itself. So you can see we're about $31 trillion of national debt. That's a big number, right? It's a big. If you look at gross domestic product, we're about 26 trillion in gross domestic product. So think about this, okay? And I know that I'm loath to make these comparisons between households and government, because I think it just doesn't work. It really just doesn't work at all. But here's one thing. Let's say that you're acquiring debt because you're going to medical school. Graduate from, you have $200,000 in debt. Now, and then you become a physician and your income grows and grows and grows to the point where that 200,000 is not that big of a deal. It's different than if you simply put up $200,000 in credit card debt and you were making close to minimum wage. That would be a whole different story. It is relative to the amount of income you got in order to service the debt. So if the US GDP continues to rise, we can theoretically outrun the debt if our economy grows faster than when our debt rises. Now, the debt is a little bit outsized now because of COVID. We have two different things going on, which is what we see happening during slowdowns, and that is the debt goes up while GDP does not rise as quickly. And so the debt to GDP ratio is over 100%. It's about 120, something like 120%, something like that. And nobody knows what the right ratio is, but this is not that high in relation to other countries. It's just that it's high for where we have been historically. And we don't know what's really going to happen in the long run. Now, one thing, if I can find it here, is the debt. Interest on the debt, interest per adult, $14,000 a year, interest on the debt. But what does that mean? Does that mean you pay $14,000? Not really. I mean, per adult, that's the amount on this total amount there. I mean, that may be your claim for the entire amount, but it's not going to be paid off this year. So it's not like they're going to come through and say, you know, 14,000 is due from you this year. So if you think about it in that context, this is one place where I do sort of make the exception to the household and government metaphor. If your income goes up, nobody ever says, hey, you crazy fool, you went to medical school. What are you thinking, right? You have $200,000 in debt. Well, now you're earning $800,000 a year as a doctor. Well, it is one thing to acquire debt that you can't service, but it's another thing if you can service the debt. And the government right now has had no trouble doing it. Now we've already hit the limit, and so now what do? The Congress has got to raise the limit. And of course, I started out this last session by just railing against the Congress because I really think they've got to deal with it. We do this about every 3 or 4 years. We go through this ridiculous scenario where they play chicken with the deficit, and then they'll close down Stone for 3 days or whatever, or the Washington Monument will be closed. It's symbolic, but it's also very silly, and it sometimes means people don't get paid. I know the first time it happened, I was actually in the private sector at the time, and there were government agencies that we really needed to rely upon because we needed to get with them for things that we couldn't because the government. So the government is going to raise the debt limit. They are going to do it. It's going to happen. They're trying to extract concessions from the president. I don't think the president has got any. By the way, Joe Biden's been in Washington a very long time. He knows how this game works, and he knows how it's going to end. And so I think he's just simply refusing to play the game that ultimately is going to end the very same way, probably. Okay, so I just think this is, this is not exactly expert, but everyone kind of looks. I put this on the board. Everyone just on the screen. Everyone just kind of looks at it. It is kind of mesmerizing. It just kind of.
I know. I'm just.
And everybody, people just kind of look at it like it is just kind of a mesmerizing thing. Anyway, it's usdebtclock.org is the website. So I found out about several years ago, and occasionally I'll pull it up, and it's kind of hard to take your eyes off because there's just so much going on there. So anyway, that's all that I had for today, and I'm going to pick up from where we left off, and I think we'll have plenty of time to cover the rest of what I intended to do today. This is a fairly big topic. This idea of this idea of fiscal policy and what it means to the economy generally. So when we come back on, try to get the camera movement. My camera's off. There we go. When we come back on Thursday, talk more about fiscal policy. I also want to give a bit of a contrast, comparing and contrasting with monetary policy to see which is most effective and why. And I'll post these PowerPoint slides. By the way, I wanted to mention one other thing. Somebody had mentioned to me that the YouTube video last Tuesday, the 4th, was sort of messed up. They got some weird error message, and I didn't catch it. I apologize. I fixed it, I think, last night. So if you see something wrong in these video links, just let me know. Sometimes they don't always work for whatever reason, but just let me know if you would. Okay? Have a great rest of your day. See you next time.